Hello, everyone. This is Chris Laparty. I'm here with my great friend Dan Cortine, and you're listening to A Father's Love Healing Through Heartache. We are extremely excited to continue to grow our podcast, and this week we have our first guest, Rachel Frasier, here. She's going to share her story with us about grief and her situation, what she went through, and she's also going to share some of her experiences of what worked for her and what didn't, and how people tried to help her. And again, this is going to be like all our other episodes, very raw, us giving information to you. So we hope you learned something from this, and we're excited to have you here, Rachel. Dan, how are you? Good to see you again.
I'm good, Chris. Thank you, Rachel. It's great to see you. It's been a while. Rachel and I used to work together back in 2009 and part of 2010. And we've kept up on Facebook, but we haven't seen each other since then. And it's great to see you. Awful under these conditions, but it's good to see you, a wonderful old friend.
It's good to see you too, Dan. And I was thinking about it, telling my story. You were actually kind of there for the beginning of my story because I remember meeting you for the first time when our staff was meeting and saying, I just got married. You're like, oh, tell me more.
Mm-hmm.
So the time that Dan and I were teaching together was really the time that I had just married my husband, John. John was an amazing person. He was a perfect balance for me. So I am one of those people that I am up and down and all around emotionally. And John was just even keeled. For me, I will always say he was the best earthly example of God's love. There was a point where I had to go to him and say, I've lost my job and I don't know what I'm going to do. And I expected him to just explode over this. But instead, he just wrapped me in a hug and he said, we'll figure it out. So knowing John really changed my life for the better. I'm a better person for the 10 years that I knew John. Now, when we met online, and then 11 months later, we got married. He moved here from Missouri to marry me. And then shortly after that's when I met Dan. So Dan worked across the hall from me for a year and got to see the beginning of my relationship with John. Where things kind of started to go wonky was the end of summer, early fall of 2015, because we were on a trip to the beach with family, and John just had no energy. He couldn't sleep well. He wasn't comfortable. It just wasn't him. He had this playful personality. Even though he was 9 years older than me, there were times when he just had the joy of a child, and he wasn't doing that. He spent the whole trip in bed. And I remember one of my aunts looking at me and saying, he needs to see a doctor, something's wrong. And I was like, yeah, but have you ever tried to tell a man that he needs to see the doctor? It just doesn't go well. So we kept having that conversation, and he would say, I'm going to go to the doctor. And then he'd say, I feel better now. And it was this cycle of, I don't feel good, I'm going to the doctor. And then I feel better now. Fast forward to November of 2015. And he sent me a text one day that he was going to urgent care during the workday. There was one just down the street from where he worked. He didn't feel well. He was going to urgent care. They did some blood work and sent him on his way. And then about a week later, he went back to urgent care. And the interesting thing is I was actually at school doing CPR and first aid training when I got a text from John that said he'd gone to urgent care and they were sending him to the hospital. They wanted him to go to the emergency room. And he said, I don't think I want to go. So I showed the text to the EMT that was running our training. And he was like, you get on the phone and you tell him to go right now and that you're meeting him at the hospital. That was Saturday. We spent several days at the hospital trying to figure out what was going on with John. It was clear that he was anemic, so he was losing blood, but they couldn't figure out where. And it was partway through that week that Dr. Graham walked into the room and looked at us and said, he's got cancer. He's got cancer. It was stage 4 colorectal cancer. And we were in the hospital for almost a week trying to get his blood counts back up to where they needed to be. And the day after we left the hospital, we were at the chemo clinic doing his first round of chemo. So at that point, we were told that his cancer was treatable but not curable. But we were also told that he was going to do chemo, he was going to do radiation, and by the following, because it was right around Thanksgiving. And so I remember the doctor looking at us and saying, by next Thanksgiving, you'll have a great Thanksgiving. Um, John would do chemo one day every other week, and it would take the whole day. So I'm a teacher, and I took off every other Monday to take John to chemo. The amazing thing is, my kids at school were part of the best support system possible. I firmly believe that all of my kids have jobs in my classroom. So my sub would say, the brain dance leader is going to lead the warm up. The DJ knows how to start and stop the music. So my kids ran the classroom for me when I was gone. And so it just got to be our pattern that I missed every other Monday. The kids would wish us well while we were gone. I'd take John to treatment. We'd sit there together. I was learning some mindfulness practices as part of my work with kids, and that proved to be really helpful with John. So we would do breathing when they would insert the needle into his port. And the other thing they don't tell you is that the people at the chemo clinic become your family. So his nurse Marcy was family, and she would pick on John, and he'd pick right back at her. And I'd walk in, and she'd give me a big hug. But this became our pattern, was this sense of chemo. So we would do several rounds of chemo, and then John did radiation. So I spent most of my summer break that first year driving him to work, and then taking him to radiation, and then taking him back to work, and then picking him up. By the end of the summer, they had told us he'd be done with chemo for a while, but we were back on chemo by the end of the summer. And that became the pattern, was we tried this chemo for a while, it'd be effective for so long, and then it'd lose its effectiveness, and then we'd switch to another type of chemo. This continued until early 2018. And I remember, y'all, I just remember walking into the clinic with John one day, and Dr. Graham looking at him and saying, "It really is a pleasure to see you." And John was like, "Yeah, it's always great to see you." And he goes, "No, I really didn't think I'd see you in 2018. And I remember hearing that and thinking, oh, this is closer than we think it is. So that February, he had an ostomy. So he had that surgery performed to try to give him some relief and some comfort. And then early April came spring break for me. I went home for spring break thinking, I need this. I need this break. And I'm going to have a week with John. We went to his doctor on Tuesday, and that's when they said, yeah, it's not good. It's moved into his liver, and we're going to call hospice at this point. So we met with hospice on Wednesday. That night, they brought it, because they started to push it off. I was like, no, we're not pushing this off. And so that night, they brought in the hospital bed and the oxygen tank. And I had the hospice admissions group, the social worker they sent, looked at me and said, have you made any plans or arrangements for what you're going to do when he dies? And I was like, no, I haven't. And she goes, you want to go ahead and have that in place now. So talking about things that are helpful, one of my good friends then started for me calling around and pricing cremations, because John wanted to be cremated, and took care of all the paperwork for me. So when it came time, I had told the hospice people what funeral home we were using, and I went in the day after John died and signed paperwork. It was all set up for me. So that was a huge gift that friend gave me. But John's family flew in on Thursday. Saturday, he saw his work friends. After they left, it felt like he had worn himself out and wasn't able to communicate much anymore. And Sunday night, about 5 minutes before midnight, with his dad sitting on one side holding one hand and me sitting on the other side holding another hand, John took his last breath. Yeah. So I will forever be grateful, especially after watching all these people that we know who've had family members die during the COVID crisis, that I was with him and I held his hand.
Well, Rachel, that's really hard story to hear, to be honest, because I've never heard a story like that. I don't know anyone that has passed away from cancer personally, so I don't really know. I never knew how kind of it went. So hearing that story, I can definitely understand what a difficult moment that must have been, of course. Um, I had a question about, I was listening to what you were saying about the doctors and how one of the doctors was actually surprised, like you said, that Johnny made it that long. And I was kind of curious how you felt in terms of like your trust in doctors now. Do you feel like they guided you right the whole time, or do you feel um, anything could have been done differently now as you're looking back?
It's funny that you asked that, Chris, because that week that we were in the hospital, it seemed like every time I turned around, another doctor was walking into the room to talk to us, and they would hand us their card every time. And I would take the card. I had a stack of them, and John looked at me at one point. He's like, "What do you think you're going to do with all these cards?" And I was like, "I don't know, but they're giving them to me. I'm going to hold on to them." And so there was a point where one doctor who was a surgeon had walked in and had said, we're going to remove this. Like, we're going to go in, he's going to do chemo, and we're going to go in and cut this out, this tumor out. And he might do radiation. And he's like, but y'all will still be able to have kids. I mean, like, this is what this doctor said to us. And then later that night, Dr. Graham, who's the doctor that we ended up working with, walked in, and he was talking, and he said, "Do you have any questions?" And John said, "Well, no, because that one guy came in and said, we're going to do surgery, we're going to remove it, we're going to this and that and the other." And when he said we could still have kids, like, the look on Dr. Graham's face was just shock. Um, and he goes, "Who said that to you?" I mean, he was just livid. He goes, "Who said that to you?" And I remember shuffling through all the cards and pulling one out because I couldn't form words at that point, but I just threw it to him and handed him the card. And he's like, "This guy said that to you?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he goes, "I don't understand why we give people false hope." And that's actually part of why we worked with him, was we felt like he was shooting from the hip with us. He wasn't doom and gloom. He never told us until the very end, when it was like, you've got days to weeks, when we were working with hospice. He never told us a time frame. He never like did anything like that, but we always felt like he was very factual with us and let us know what was going on. He showed us all the images. He talked us through everything. He was always late coming into appointments, but it was because when he was with you, he sat with you and talked through everything and answered every question that you had. So you'd think that this would make me not trust doctors, but really, truly, like, there's always going to be part of me that wonders if I had gotten John to go to the doctor earlier, if we might have had a different outcome. But there's also part of me that absolutely trusts doctors, because I did have 2.5 more years with him because of the work that these people did.
I think that's a great point, and it's going to be situational for everyone. Really, like we've talked with my story, and there's some things I don't trust with doctors now because I don't feel like I got the information like you got. I think I got a lot more of those. Everything's going to be great, doctors, and not that I put my trust in them because they're the professionals. And so for people that are listening, you really have to kind of feel your doctor out. And I think an important point is, if you don't feel comfortable with a doctor, to get another one, ask for someone else. I think that's an important point to bring up. Dan, what about you? Any questions?
I don't think I have a question yet, but it's painful to listen to this because, yeah, Rachel and I met when she had just met John not long ago. And Rachel and I met, 2 months before Jameson was born. I think that was the year. And I remember the staff, because we were opening up a new school. And I remember the staff threw us a baby shower. And it just blew my mind that this group of people that we had known literally 2 months was being so generous. And as Rachel said, we were right across the hall from each other. We were in each other's rooms all day, every day. working together as a media specialist and a tech, just working together, tossing ideas around, but also just as friends. We quickly formed a great friendship that we could just talk to each other and enjoy the company that we had during the day. And to hear your story of just how that honeymoon so quickly changed, it's heartbreaking.
Well, and Dan, the interesting thing is about the time that I met you, like I said before, John and I knew each other 11 months when we got married. And he, like, when I say we met online, I mean like old school chat room, we met online, not on a dating website. It was in like a trivia chat room. And I remember thinking, this guy's nice. And we chatted for about 5 nights. And then on the fifth night, he sent me a message and said, would it be okay if I called you tomorrow to wish you a happy birthday? Because it was the week before my birthday. And so John called me for my birthday and we talked for several hours. And then from that point on, we talked every day for several hours. Like I would hear the door slam as he left work, and we would talk until I fell asleep that night until the day he moved here. And I mean, like, he really was my best friend. And I know you saw that, Dan. He would joke all the time. He called you my work husband. And he's like, hey, how's my work husband doing? And I'm like, he's great. He's had this baby. I mean, it really was a magical year. But people would say to me, people that had known me for a while, don't you feel like you're rushing things? To this guy's just moving in and you're getting married, and don't you feel like you're rushing things? And at the time I was like, no, we just know that we need to be together. So John ended up dying a few weeks after our 9th anniversary. I knew him a grand total of 10 years. And, he died April 9th, and I had met him April 13th. So it just felt like looking back, I am so glad that we rushed into things, because if that had
Yeah.
dragged out longer, that would have been less time that I knew him and that he was a part of my life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Live every moment for what it is now. Like Dan says with his foundation with Jameson's Joy. Like enjoy the moment, enjoy the time with your loved ones. You can't take a second for granted. And yeah, great point. I had another question actually, if you wouldn't mind maybe explaining to people that don't even understand the process with hospice and how it all kind of worked for you. Dan and I have obviously very different situations. We didn't have to deal with anything like that. But I think it'd be some good information for people to really have a firm understanding of what hospice is and how it actually helped you out.
Yeah. So early, like January 2018, the PA looked at us and said, have you thought about palliative care? And my brain immediately jumped to hospice. And she said, no, palliative care is different. It's similar but different. And so palliative care, I now know, is all about providing comfort to somebody that's going through some difficult medical situation. And at that point, and then especially once he had his surgery and had his ostomy, we had healthcare workers that were coming into the home to help him. So he needed some PT at some point. He had a PT that came in regularly. He needed help with his ostomy care. His ostomy nurse came over regularly. So know that if somebody looks at you and says, have you thought about palliative care? It doesn't mean that your person's dying or even dying right away. It means that they're just looking at, is there a way that we can offer some support to help you out and help you be more comfortable? Hospice, though, does tend to be at the point that they know that we're looking at end of life care. And so that was very clear to me the day that they said, we need to call hospice, that that's what that meant. It's still a form of palliative care. We still had people coming into the house to help, but at that point, there were some things that got put into place that I wish I had thought about earlier and hadn't. And that was, like the initial intake team that comes in typically will be a nurse, a social worker. So they try to send somebody in to provide some spiritual support, but they do have a team that comes in to meet with you to ask you questions. And so at first they met with both of us, and then they looked and said, we'd really like to split you up and talk to you separately. And that was hard for me because of the state John was in. I did hit a point where just to leave the room or just to sleep just felt selfish. So it was hard for me to step out of the room. I ended up talking with the social worker while he talked with the nurse. And then they switched. And so the social worker is the person that looked at me and said, "Have you thought about arrangements?" And I said, "No, I have not." She also looked at me and said, "What are you doing to take care of yourself?" Because let's be honest, I hadn't been taking care of myself for 2.5 years at that point. It had all been John. I would work all day and then come home to John. So she said that, who do you have that can support? Like, she really helped me think through all of those things, and she talked me through the process. Because the other thing that needs to happen typically once hospice becomes involved is you end up signing a DNR, a do not resuscitate. And that way, and you also have something that you put up in your house so that anybody that's there knows if something happens, we don't call EMS, we call the hospice line. So I remember filling out the paperwork, and on TV they make it sound like you get that DNR right away. It's actually something that gets mailed to you. I got John's DNR in the mail the day after he died, and I just remember feeling like that was such a sucker punch. But it was just because things happen so quickly. Typically, after they've met with you and talked through that, then there's another team that becomes your hospice team. And just because of the timing with things falling right before the weekend and then him dying over the weekend, we never actually met his hospice team. We kind of had a triage group. The other thing that happened with John that I now know from other experiences doesn't always happen is sometimes there's like a hospice box that you keep in your refrigerator that has emergency medication that's just general medication that they know people might need, and it stays in the refrigerator. And so if something's happening and you call the hospice nurse and they say they ask for details, and then they'll say, "Go get this out of the box and give this to him." Or there was a point where the nurse stopped by the house and said, "I need the box." So that was just an interesting thing that I wasn't prepared for, to have a box sitting in my refrigerator. And then I remember the next day, my parents needed a job. They needed something to do. And I was like, "Please take all of his medication to the police department. I need it out of the house." But hospice worked to get us a hospital bed for him. Hospice had an oxygen tank for him. They literally looked at us and said, "Is there anything that you can think of that you might need?" And they took care of that. And they took care of the paperwork with the insurance company. So there was not a point where I got a bill from hospice. It all went through the insurance company.
It sounds like it went as planned as well as it could for the short amount of time you had. So that's a good thing. I'm glad to hear that went so well. Dan?
Yeah, and I can't say enough about the hospice workers. They, like, you have to have a certain type of personality to be able to go into a home in a situation like that. And they truly, hospice workers and chemo nurses, man, they are the kindest people you will ever meet. They have huge hearts. So yeah, if you get to that point, it's not somewhere you want to be, but please consider letting hospice come in to help you. It really made a difference for both of us at that point.
You mentioned three things that I wrote down that just really struck me. First, the stuff in the house. Chris and I don't know if we've mentioned it in any of our other talks yet, but that is one of the hardest things, at least for my experience. Because, and I guess that you mentioned the sucker punch of the DNR too, and I guess they kind of tie together. Of when we lose someone that we care about, there are reminders daily, and usually daily there are hundreds of reminders, and none of them are good. We get even pictures and stuff for that split second. They may put a tiny nugget of joy in our heart, but we quickly go back to the fact that that person is gone. And one of the many things I feel so sorry for the Lepardi family for, and I admire them so much, is that Chris and his family packed up and moved a few months ago, or I guess back in November, right, Chris? And we're 2 years in our house, and we still hadn't touched Jameson's room. We couldn't, and up until a couple months ago. And here you are, Rachel, the day after, dealing with medication is just one of probably an infinite number of examples. And then Chris and Amanda had to pack up their entire house and move across the country. So you all didn't have that luxury that I feel fortunate, I guess, in that I wasn't forced to go through any of that kind of stuff so quickly until we felt we were more ready. I just wonder, Rachel, how, yeah, with everything that John, of all of John's stuff and the all the hospice materials and all that, how did you handle all of that side of things?
Well, it's interesting because different people deal with things differently. And it was also a different situation. So you two were both given an emergent situation that you had no clue was coming. And I mean, I didn't want to think about the fact that John was going to die, but it was pretty clear that John, I mean, we know we were all going to die, but we kind of saw a trajectory. The end came faster than I thought it would, but we were kind of on this trajectory. And so interestingly, like as far as the hospice stuff goes, that next morning, my sister went with me. We went to go sign the paperwork and pay for the cremation. And when I came home, hospice had already come by to pick up all of the stuff that they had brought. And one of the things that I worried about, I remember driving home every day because we hit a point where John couldn't sit. I mean, it was rectal cancer. He just couldn't sit. And so he would spend his day in bed and he was home on disability. And every day I would come home, and if I hadn't heard from him in the last hour or so, there was always this thought of, am I getting ready to walk in the house and find my husband dead in bed? And that's just really hard. So one of the things that I worried about a lot was John gonna die in a bed that I then had to sleep in? So when hospice said, do you want us to bring a bed? I was like, oh yes, please. Please bring a bed. And they go, would you like us to set it up in the bedroom or the living room? And I was like, the living room. Please put this bed in the living room. Partly because then everybody could be around him because everybody wanted to see him so he could visit comfortably. But also partly because, I mean, yes, I know. I sit on my couch and occasionally I look across the room and think, John died right there. But I knew that meant he wasn't going to die in my bed, and I wasn't going to have to sleep in the bed that my husband died in. The other interesting thing is he lost a tremendous amount of weight. I mean, Dan, you know, he was a large man. John, when he first got sick, was over 300 pounds, and he was 6 foot tall. And he lost weight so rapidly. Like one of the things that gave him joy was the fact that he got to buy new clothes all the time. I felt like every time I turned around, there was a package on the doorstep where John had ordered something new. He was so excited when he didn't need big and tall clothes. He could fit a normal size. But as he kept losing weight, he kept having to buy new clothes, and he would bag up his old clothes and I would take them to donate them. So interestingly, like there are a couple of things of his that I kept. He had been attending culinary school, so I have his jacket or his shirt with his name embroidered on it. There's a shirt that he wore to chemo all the time that I said, like there are a couple of things like that. I have a couple of his hats. But as far as clothing goes, by the time we got to the point that he died, the clothing that I had any emotional connection to was already out of the house. And I remember finding like pants with the tags still on them in the closet. And my sister and my best friend, like Wednesday of the week after he died, came over to help me go through stuff because I was like, I don't even know where to start. Right. And I remember them going, are you sure you want to get rid of this? And I'm like, he never wore those pants. I have no attachment to those pants. The thing that drove me a little bit crazy is that for a good 2.5 years after he died, I found paperwork everywhere. Like I loved the man, but he was not organized. And so he would open his mail and just shove it back in the envelope and stack it up. And I would think, I've gone through all the mail now. And then I'd find a box somewhere and I'm like, oh gosh, I'm still going through the mail. the fact that I still get mail for him, like AARP sent him something the other day, and I'm like, seriously, you're sending my dead husband mail, and it's been 3 years now since he died. So like that's the piece of it that's a little bit frustrating, and I don't know what to do about it. So like my sister said, until you let them know, and I'm like, I can't let. There's nothing out there to let the whole world know that John's dead, and they can stop sending him mail. But as far as things, I have a box of pocket knives because the man loved a pocket knife. So I've got 15 pocket knives, and I've got his wallet and his glasses and things like that. But I don't have the clothes and things that a lot of people keep just because he wasn't wearing those clothes anymore.
It's interesting to listen to your perspective on that, because Chris and I are on the other side of it. Do you have moments where you remember something that you did throw out and you're like, why did I throw that out? Or do you feel comfortable consistently that you're good?
I can honestly say that there has never been a moment where I thought, I wish I hadn't gotten rid of that. Now, his car sat in my driveway, undrivable and undriven for 2 years. It was last year, around the time of his anniversary of his death. I was like, this car's got to get out of my driveway. And interestingly, the car, like, his dad moved it out of the driveway the night he died because you have to move all the cars for the funeral home to be able to get into the driveway and get the body. So his dad moved it because it was a stick shift and I don't drive a stick. And then his dad moved it back in. And then after that, we couldn't get into the car. Like we had the keys. You could put the key in the lock and it wouldn't turn. We couldn't get into the car for 2 years. We could get into the trunk, but that was it. And so I finally was talking to somebody about towing I was donating another car. And I said, look, I've got this car. What can I do with it? And he said, we'll figure it out when we get there. Well, the night before they came to tow it, I put the key in and it turned. And so like I cleaned all the stuff out of John's car, and John was a clutter bug. So it was a lot of junk. But like I found a CD that I had burned him that 11 months that we've been dating and that type of thing. So there are definitely still moments where I have big emotion. I was listening to a podcast this morning and somebody said that they were excited that they'd seen their favorite band. And when they said their favorite band was the Mavericks, well, that was John's favorite band too. And so like I'm trying to walk out the door for school and I'm crying. So that still happens all the time. More than anything, I've reached a point, I mean, I miss John desperately, but there's this feeling of, am I going to be alone? Am I going to be alone for the rest of my life? Because there's nobody like John, and it's a high standard. I've dated a couple people, it's not gone well, because they just can't compare, you know? And so this notion, like you guys get it, you thought you knew what the rest of your life held, and that abruptly changed. And so there's that piece of, this was the person that I was supposed to be with. Yeah.
Definitely a hard thing to think about, for sure. Yeah, definitely. I don't even know what to say, to be honest, Rachel. Such a hard idea to think, so I don't even know where to go with, to be honest.
Well, and Chris, I'll say the other weird thing, because what I get told all the time is you're such a young widow, which is funny because I feel so old lately. I just had another birthday. But I get told all the time, you're such a young widow. Or people would say, like, I did finally get a therapist a year ago. I totally recommend getting somebody who specializes in grief. But people would say, have you thought about a widows group? And I'm like, have you looked at who's in the widows group? They tend to be older widows, and they're people who are trying to figure out, like, I've lived my life, I've raised my kids, my partner died, what do I do now? And I was like, I'm in the middle of my life, I have no kids. And then the perfect storm of things is like John died, 11 months later my mom died, and then a year after that this pandemic happened. And so I wasn't dealing with my feelings at all. I was just going to work all the time. I buried myself in work. My side job, I do training. And so I was traveling all the time. If somebody's like, hey, can you come to Oklahoma for a week? Absolutely. That means I'm not sitting at home thinking about things. And then a pandemic happened, and it started about the time of the anniversary of John's death, and I had to think about things. And it, like, I hit my lowest low a year ago, and I felt it again this last week or two because it's been the anniversary again. So being alone is hard, but being alone in a pandemic, whew, it's tough stuff.
Yeah, that's got to be extremely hard. Our last episode, we talked a lot about mental health and, grief counseling, and I went pretty early. I know Dan said he waited a little bit more. He had more support from his church in that sense. And, um, you know, here's another person, folks. We're telling you, if you need help, go get it. There's no shame in it at all to go get help and actually talk about your feelings and what's going on. I was wondering if I could change topics and ask another question in terms of, so Dan and I have talked a lot about what people did that helped us and maybe what people did that didn't help us, even though they thought it was helping us. So I was wondering if you could maybe go over a couple of those examples of when John first passed, what were some of the support you got that really made a big difference if people want to help someone that's going, they have a friend that maybe lost a spouse, what they can do to help them, and maybe something they should consider staying away from when it comes to that.
So I'm actually going to start with the things that weren't helpful and then end with the things that were. So there were things that people would say to me that they thought were kind and helpful things. And it's because you don't know. You're trying to figure out what you would want to hear if you were in the situation. So there are a couple of things that were minor triggers for me, and there were a couple of things that, like, to this day, there are some of my friends who are like, please don't say that to her because she's just going to go off, type of thing. One of the things that's hard to hear is people still look at me regularly because it's been an interesting 5 years. And people will still look at me and go, oh, but Rachel, you are so strong. You are just the strongest person I know. I could never go through what you went through and come out the way you did. And they mean well when they say it. I already have an issue with showing big feelings. I've always believed, whether it was true or not, that my big feelings make other people uncomfortable. So when people praise me for my strength, what I internalize is I've got to be strong and I can't show you those big feelings. And I mean, somebody said it to me the other day, and I just looked at them and I said, what if I don't want to be strong right now? Like, what if I would like to be the one to just fall apart? I know now, after doing some digging, that this base of strength is actually a trauma response for me from this situation and from some situations in the past. And so people see it and think it's a great thing, and in my head I'm thinking, no, this is a lower brain state that you're seeing. You are not seeing me at my best when you see this. You're just seeing a trauma response. There were two other big things that people would say to me, and especially right after John died, people would look at me and go, if you need anything, just let me know, which sounds really helpful. But what that did was that then put all the responsibility for figuring out what I needed on me. And then, like, it's not like I had a list. I wasn't writing a list of all the people who had said to let them know if I needed something. What I know about the brain now, because of my job, is that in a lower brain state, you can't access your frontal lobe, and so you can't problem solve. So I'm in a lower brain state, and people are like, well, if you need something, let me know. And I didn't know what I needed until 5 minutes after I needed it, type of thing. So the flip of that, what was really helpful was when people would look at me and say, I'm going to the grocery store. Can I get you some milk and bread and eggs? Or, you know what, we're cooking a big dinner. Do you want to come over tonight? Or can I bring you the leftovers? Like when people would problem solve for me, there was a day I came home, and I'm allergic to grass. I can't mow the lawn. And I came home and the lawn fairy had mowed my lawn while I was gone. I still don't know who did it, but that was really helpful. Like for the first summer, a friend of mine paid somebody to mow my lawn. So the more you can look at really practical ways, things that you can do to be helpful, and say, can I do this for you that gives the person that's grieving the chance to say, yes, that would be helpful, or no, that wouldn't be helpful. And to know that there were some people that I could say, no, that wouldn't be helpful, and they'd be like, okay, and not have to worry about hurting their feelings, that was really great. Um, and then the last thing that is still a trigger, I mean, it really is a trigger for me, is when people would look at me and say, but he's still with you, or John's still with you. And I know people have different feelings about this. Some people hold on to that notion that their loved one is still with them in some way. For me, I watched my husband die. And then the other thing that they don't tell you is it takes a while. Like, as soon as they die, you call hospice and they send a nurse out to determine time of death and to prepare the body. But it takes a while. It takes at least an hour. So John died just before midnight on April 8th, but his legal death is April 9th because that's when they could determine time of death. And then but because of that, and it's weird that I consider this a blessing, but I watched my husband's body change and really strongly could see that that was not my husband anymore. And so I remember her, like the nurse when she showed up said, do you want a moment with him? And I'm like, I've had an hour with him and that's not my husband anymore. Like my sister will tell you, I just kept saying, that's not my husband anymore. It was very clear that his spirit had left his body. But this notion that John's still with me, like I remember yelling at somebody one day, I was like, no, he is not. He is not here. I am alone. I know in my head that I'm never alone, but I feel so alone right now. And you telling me that John's here makes me so angry. It does. It just makes me so angry when people say that to me. So things that were helpful that people said, I had a friend that just looked at me one day and she goes, this sucks.
Mm-hmm.
And I went, oh my gosh, it does. It just sucks. And I still have people who will say that to me. And I'm like, oh, thank you. Like, they're not trying to happy me up. They're just like, yeah, this sucks. Or a friend that I got upset with for saying John was still here looked at me and she goes, oh, like when I explained it, she goes, I can see how you feel that way. And there's just something about having somebody, instead of trying to happy you up, say, I can see how you feel that way. Or if I'd start to say something about John, instead of getting uncomfortable, tell me more about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I do have friends who will look at me and be like, you know what? You never told me the story of how you and John met. Or what did you do on your first anniversary? Or what's the funniest thing John ever said? And that's just really helpful to have people help me remember instead of trying to avoid hearing about John and my memories.
Yeah, I think those are some great points. I think a lot of times with loved ones, when they pass, people don't want to talk about them anymore. They feel like they're making you uncomfortable for some reason. But really, that's all we really want to talk about is we want to talk about the great moments. At least that's how I felt for sure. How about you, Dan?
Yeah, I'm just writing things down over here that I think we could have Rachel back over and over again. That, yeah, my sister has been phenomenal at asking me to tell stories about Jameson. And as we've discussed before, there is no way for anybody to know what they say, whether it's going to help or hurt. But even if it hurts, you can't go wrong talking about our loved ones, asking for stories about them, sharing memories. Because again, at least for those small moments, we're going to have nuggets of happy memories that, at least for that moment, the pain isn't as sharp and severe. So I think that's amazing. Gosh, my neighbor literally yesterday just lost a dear family member, and she's one of the future guests, and her her story is going to crush you all. As bad as we have it, when you hear the loss that my neighbor's been through, it's just incomprehensible in every way. But I was reading through her Facebook page this morning and just looking at the comments. And again, as Rachel said, and as Chris and I have said, everybody means well. But somebody had posted a poem, and it was all about how your loved one is still here. They're hearing the butterflies, they're hearing the birds, the wind, and all that. And the last line says, she didn't die. And I have not talked to one single person who has lost a loved one that has been even remotely close to helpful, because it's like, no, as Rachel just said, no, he's dead. I've been here for an hour with him, and Jameson was dead. I was there with him for 20, 30 minutes before EMS, and I saw him in the hospital, and I visited with him all week in the funeral home, and yeah, he's dead. And Chris held Mason for a couple days, and yeah, they're dead, and yeah, you mean well, but that's just an awful, awful thing, I think, to say. I think listening to Rachel, it sounds like you have a wonderful group of friends that supported you, and the one that really stood out was the one that you were with, that you alluded to when people were coming up. They could just sense that this is not a good time to be near Rachel. Hold off. Or, hey, what you're saying is probably not going to go over well. And they protected you. And that, I think, is wonderful. I remember when Jameson died, we had all our friends out there that first weekend, and we were talking about going to church or not, and Eric was like, no way. I do not want to be around people. And one of my buddies said, this is actually probably the best day for you to go, because look at the security you have. And she's like, good point. And we did go to church, and we had 7 friends and 2 or 3 pastors surrounding us so that nobody could get close to us. And we could go there, we could try to get close to God, because as a Christian, that's where we're supposed to go and try to cling for joy and happiness. But we didn't have to relive the what happened or the I'm so sorry 100 times that morning. And then at the end of service, I looked up and they were gone already. I didn't even get out of my seat, and they had already whisked her out of the building, and she was at the car already, totally safe. And Rachel, it warms my heart to hear you tell the stories of those friends that you have that mowed your lawn, brought you meals, went shopping, protected you from people.
Well, and the other interesting thing, Dan, is I had lots of teacher friends at school who tried to protect me from kids. And for me, it was actually very therapeutic to talk to kids, because kids aren't trying to talk around it. They're not trying to happy you up. They're just being straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that was really awkward was my kids had known for 2.5 years that John was sick. We have a ritual that we do every day at school where we wish people well, and it's all about having empathy for others and sending positive energy. Well, my kids had been wishing John well for 2.5 years, and then we go to spring break and John dies, and I missed the whole week after spring break to deal with that. And so other people were covering my classes, and I remember talking to somebody at school on the admin team, and them saying, what can we do? What would be helpful? And I said, you've got to tell the kids. And they're like, what do you mean? I was like, they've been wishing him well. And I said, what have y'all been telling him today? Because it was at the end of the first day. And they said, well, we've got a TA in there. Talk about people wanting to do their best. We've got a TA in there, and she's just been telling them all day that you're keeping John safe. Because that's one of the things we talk about a lot in our school family, is that it's my job to keep you safe. And so, like, I tell my kids every day at some point, it's my job to keep you safe, and it's your job to help keep it safe. And I did tell them when I was out, I'm going to be out because I'm taking Mr. Frasier to the doctor, because it's my job to keep him safe too. And so it just struck me that John's dead, and yet staff is telling him that the reason I'm not there is because I'm keeping him safe. And I just remember saying, what message is this sending to kids? Because I tell them every day that I'm going to keep them safe, and you're telling them that, and now I'm going to have to say John died. while you thought I was keeping him safe. Like, this just seems like such a crazy thing to me. And it hit a point where what our admin was advised from the district was that I needed to be the one to tell the kids. And it only needed to be the kids that I teach. But the nature of being a specialist is that all 500 kids at our school were kids that I taught and who knew what was going on. So it actually was kind of therapeutic to tell my kids what had happened. But they also, like, throughout the year, I had one kid in particular that would just come crawl into my lap, and she'd look at me and she'd go, "You're sad." And I go, "I am sad."
Mm-hmm.
And she'd go, "You miss your husband." And I go, "I do miss my husband." And so having the chance to model what emotion looks like for kids and that it's okay to be sad was really good. But they're just so straightforward. It was so much better than ever dealing with the adults around me.
That is so true. And yeah, as a fellow teacher, yes, last year's group, I didn't hide it from the kids either. And I told them on the first day of school, here's my story. And there's going to be days that I just break down. And I have to ask you, when that happens, please don't laugh. Just give me the moment. I may have to leave the room, and just realize somebody will be back as quickly as possible to make sure that you're taken care of. And there were numerous times throughout the year reading a story or whatever that it triggered whatever the memory or whatever. And every single time when I started crying, it wasn't 2 seconds before I felt a hand on my back, rubbing my back, or a student giving me a hug or bringing me a tissue. Kids are amazing, and we can learn so much from how they react to things and treat people.
Yeah, I would turn and look, and they would all be wishing me well. And so we do like we have a song that we sing with the younger groups, like it's this whole thing. But they had internalized it so much that when I would get upset, instead of jumping up and being concerned, I would see them turn and they would just put their hands on their hearts, and I'd see them take some deep breaths, and I'm like, yeah, they're wishing me well. And they're legit wishing me well. They're not doing the thing that adults do where they pat you on the shoulder and tilt their head to the side and say, "Oh, how are you doing?" Because how am I supposed to answer that?
Mm-hmm.
This sucks. Is how
Yeah.
I'm doing. And the pat and the tilt, like I had a friend who would stand behind people when they would do this to me and just laugh, like just sit there laughing because she knew what I was thinking in my head. But yeah, kids are real.
Chris, would you agree? Rachel talking about somebody saying this sucks. Totally agree. And I've heard that from numerous people. It's like, is that really something that's okay to say? It's like, yes, that's for me and everybody I know probably in the top 5 of the best things you can say, because it's the truth and it's not fake.
I would definitely agree, and it does suck. Every day sucks, really. And one of the things I think you said that I've heard numerous people say now, and I know I personally feel, is I hate when people say, "Man, you're so strong," and I'm like, I really don't have a choice here. I didn't pick this life. I didn't pick for this to happen. So while I appreciate because you think you're complimenting me, we're just trying to make it through the moment, really. So you're another person that we've talked to, Rachel, that has said that that's not the best thing to say. So for our listeners, if you're talking to someone that's dealing with grief, that's another important fact to stay away from that "you're so strong" comment. While you think you're doing good, you're really just, for some reason, it's just a trigger for all of us that are dealing with grief that we're not that strong. We have no choice. We have to go day by day still. And thanks for bringing that up, Rachel. I think that's an important comment that a lot of people think is a compliment, but really kind of makes it worse.
Yeah, my advice would just to be say, "You seem," and fill in the blank. Like, "You seem sad," or "You seem lonely," or just fill in the blank and stop there. For adults, there's this piece of feeling like they've got to fill the silence. But if somebody looks at me and says, "You seem sad," then I can look at them and go, "Yeah, I am sad." Today it's been 3 years since John died. I mean, that was the other week. But I did say something, "I am sad. Today it's been 3 years since John died." And they're like, "Oh, that's really hard." And I was like, it is really hard. So I think as adults, we feel like we've got to talk for the other person and we've got to fill the silence. And one of the things that I've taken away from all of this is just the beauty of holding space for someone. Just be present and just send them your well wishes. If you're a prayer, pray for them. But they don't need all the words and they don't need all the things. There's just something about knowing that somebody's there with you and they're holding space for you and you can feel whatever you need to feel and they're okay with it. And they might join you in that feeling or they might just hold space for you.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point that Dan and I have brought up before, that, for some reason, adults feel like there has to be talking involved, that there can't be that silence, that it's somehow awkward silence. But, a lot of times that help of someone just sitting there with you and you're not alone and if you need them, you can reach out to them, but they're just there and they're your support. And that is another way that people can help if you're considering, how can I help this person? I don't know what I can do. You don't have to do anything but literally sit with them, and it's probably going to make more of a difference than you actually realize. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah. Awkward silence, I think, is a beautiful thing. I don't know anybody that's grieving that would disagree with that, because again, you're there and you're showing that you care, and it's not causing us to expend any energy that we already don't have, because we're not strong, we're surviving. That's all we can do. And it doesn't matter what it looks like. It doesn't matter if we look happy or excited or whatever. We're surviving. And awkward silence is one of the most beautiful things that we can have in our life, and I think we need in our life. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful thought, Rachel.
Rachel, I was wondering if I could ask you one more question. You brought up something super important. You said the actual taking care of yourself. You said that line.
Yeah.
And Dan and I haven't really talked about that much in our other episodes. Those first couple days trying to take care of yourself, I know were really hard for myself. And actually, for me, my first 9 months were I was kind of just a blob sitting around doing nothing. I couldn't process anything. And it took time for me to get out of that. What were some of the things that you did to try to start taking care of yourself again?
I had help at first. So my sister is amazing. I can't say enough. She's my favorite person on this planet right now. But my sister actually took a week and a half off from work. She's a teacher. She teaches music at an elementary school. So we got the arts thing covered in our family. But she took a week and a half off. When I said John's dad was on one side holding one hand and I was on the other, she was behind me with her hand on my back when John died. And like I said, she took me the next morning. She drove so that we could go sign all the paperwork for the cremation. And that week and a half, she didn't just stay to get me through the week. She stayed for a couple days to make sure I got through going back to school. So I would come home and she would have cooked. So for me, there was this piece initially of exhaustion. I'd spent 2.5 years burning the candle at both ends because I felt like I needed to be the person that took care of John. Who wants to talk about rectal cancer? The man had to talk about his butt all the time with doctors and everybody else. And so he just hit a point where he's like, can you please help me with this? And I mean, it did. It got uncomfortable for him at one point. And so I had burned the candle at both ends. I was exhausted. Knowing that school, I didn't like how it was taken care of, but school was taken care of. And I could just spend the week after John died doing what I needed to do. It helped, like I said, it helped so much that friend had already arranged for the cremation. I literally just signed some paperwork and wrote a check. But then also just taking the time to do things that I hadn't been able to do for so long. So I remember after we left the funeral home, my sister and I stopped on the way home at the craft store because I'm a crafter. I can't have enough yarn in this house. And so we stopped on the way home at the craft store, and I remember just walking around, and all of a sudden I started crying. And she goes, oh my gosh, what's happening? And I said, I felt relief. Because for the first time in 2.5 years, I wasn't worried about what was happening with John at home. And that was a hard feeling to deal with, was this sense of relief that I wasn't worrying all the time. So she at that point was like, all right, we're taking care of you. What are we going to do? We one day we drove to see one of my aunts that lives 2 hours away. And John loved her. He said she was like his mom, and she made chicken and pastry that he loved. So that day that we got there, Aunt Connie made chicken and pastry, and we ate chicken and pastry and told stories about John the whole day. I slept without setting an alarm, which, as adults is unusual, but to go to sleep and not set an alarm every chance that I got. I love burning things in a fire pit. There's something cathartic about it, just sitting around watching stuff burn. So I have spent for the last 3 years many a night sitting out by the fire pit burning stuff, or just doing things that feed my soul. I learned to play the ukulele last year, or making things, just thinking about what are the things. People say, what are the things that bring you joy? But for me, it's more about what are the things that bring me calm.
Yes.
And just embracing those things. So I listen to a lot of podcasts. It was funny when you guys were like, do you want to be on a podcast? I was like, yes.
Hopefully we're on your list now.
You are. You are. You're saved on my list. But just really thinking about what are the things that bring me calm. And then, like I said, I don't know why it took me 2 years to decide to see a therapist. But somebody just looked at me and said, look at the Psychology Today website, and they've got a search. And I entered my hometown and grief, and lucked into the first therapist that I met with was a good fit. And I know that's unusual, but it can be as easy as looking at a website and doing a search to start the process of trying to find a good therapist.
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting all the topics we talked about last week about mental health, that you find someone that works for you. It took a couple of doctors for me to find the one that I liked going to. And if you don't like it, move on to the next one and keep going until you find what you want and what's going to help you get through that moment. There's nothing saying you have to stick with the first person you go to, because if they're not a good fit, don't waste your time. It's not gonna. You're wasting your time basically. You're not gonna get what you actually need from it.
Yeah, their feelings aren't going to be hurt.
No.
If anything, they're going to be like, yeah, please go find somebody that works for you.
Again, you're just saying so many things. You just said a minute ago, I think one of the key statements that I haven't thought of it in the terms you put, and I think, again, it's so helpful, is joy is a really hard thing to have when you go through losing a husband or a child or anybody. And it's also a great Christian cliche that doesn't go over very well. But the way you said it, I think, is beautiful. You're looking for things that bring you calm. And again, we're in survival mode for years when you go through this. And yes, anything that takes the chaos out of my life for a moment is a good thing.
Yeah, and for that reason, Dan, I love a predictable pattern. Like, I know that our brains are wired to seek predictable patterns. We're always looking for patterns. But the more that I can live my life in a predictable pattern, the calmer I feel. I had enough chaos for a while, and I know the impact that had on my brain and my literal physical heart to spend 2.5 or more years dealing with just that piece. And so I'm constantly seeking predictability. I've noticed lately that whether I set the alarm or not, my body wakes up at 5:30 because that's what time I need to get up. So the more I can fall into that pattern, the better. The other thing that I'm wondering about with you guys is I, not as much now, but initially really struggled with feeling guilt anytime I felt joy.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was supposed to be, like I would joke around and say, yeah, I'm supposed to be playing the role of the grieving widow. But people acted like that was this persona that I took on all the time. And oh, poor Rachel, she must be so sad all the time because she's the grieving widow. And so there'd be times when I would laugh at a joke or, feel relief that I wasn't worried about John, or, like there were times that I would feel joy and then I would feel such guilt about that. Did you guys have similar experiences?
Absolutely. I think Chris and I have talked a lot about this personally offline, a little bit online, but absolutely. We feel guilt all the time. Anytime I laugh or giggle or have fun or anything good, there's always that background awareness that something's missing. Every time, I think Chris mentioned it, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, that every time we go out as a family, there is no family vacation now that will ever be normal again for us, because a huge part of our heart is gone. And as much fun as we may be having with the rest of our family, there's a piece missing that would be having so much fun creating other memories. And I think another important side of that is people's reactions when you do laugh or act normal. All of a sudden they think you're done grieving, and it's like, hey, how are you doing? I'm okay. Oh, great. It's like, no, you're not getting what I'm saying. And or if they see you laughing and all of a sudden they think, oh, great, Dan's healthy, he's back, he's joyful, and we don't need to worry about him anymore. And that is so wrong for, I don't know if I could say forever, but I know for 2 years and 2 months it's true so far, and I don't see it going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I felt like when John died, everybody was there and everybody wanted to do something. And then there was very clearly this cutoff point where I was supposed to have dealt with it and worked through it by then. Did you guys have a similar experience? Because it just felt like all of a sudden it's like, are you over this yet? We're ready. Are you?
Yeah, we did. I think we talked about that last week a little bit, Dan. How people, we understand people have to get back to their normal lives, but we're really not okay. We're not at that point like you might think we are. We're trying to navigate the new life, because really that's what it is. We're starting like a whole new life. At least that's how I feel with my wife and my other children. Like, I'm starting a whole new family because the family dynamic is so different now without Mason. It's starting from scratch, starting all over, and yeah, definitely difficult and different at the same time.
And I think that's where, again, I think Rachel and I are fortunate to work with kids. Because, again, kids, they don't get it, but they just naturally know how to respond and react to it. And they just know the right thing to do most of the time, or to say or not to say. And when you get into a classroom of kids and just start, as Rachel was talking about predictability a few minutes ago, teaching is pretty predictable in one way, totally unpredictable in another, but it's very predictable, and you can count on those kids just being themselves. And that, again, it's a great distractor from the pain that we're going through, that helps us just get through life every day.
Well, and kids give me a chance to practice saying it. And I know that sounds weird, but like there's that awkward moment when you're talking to adults where they'll be like, and you and your husband. And I'm like, yeah, my husband died 3 years ago. Or typically I'll say I'm a widow. And it took me a lot of practice to be able to say I'm a widow. I remember the first time I was doing a presentation after John died, looking at my mentor and saying, I don't know what to put on my intro slide. Because typically people will have a slide that pops up that shows their family and their spouse and talks about their home. And I'm like, I don't know what to put on this slide. And she goes, you put that you're a widow if you're comfortable saying that you're a widow. So I've been practicing that with adults, but with kids, like even this week, because I realized, I teach kindergarten through 5th grade, and our K2 kids were not at school when John died. So they don't know that within that context. And a kindergartner looked at me, and she's our assistant principal's daughter, and our assistant principal was standing there. But she said, "Oh, are you going to be with your husband this weekend?" And I said, "Logan, I don't have a husband." And she goes, "You never got married?" And I said, "No." I said, "I had a husband, and he died 3 years ago." But there's something about being able to talk through that with a kid that, as emotions go, is not as intimidating as having to look at an adult. Because a kid's just going to be like, "Oh," whereas an adult's going to do the hand on the shoulder and the head tilt that we were talking about before, and you get this sense of pity from adults, whereas kids are just trying to process the information.
And I think, yes, again, just a key point that I hope people hear is that, again, we will, for the rest of our life, have these little decisions that we have to make that the world doesn't have to think about. Do you put Mrs. or Ms. or Ms.? I don't know. And widow. And one for me, at least, is how many kids do you have? And I have 2 kids. I will always say I have 2 kids. And every time I say it, I'm waiting for that follow-up question of, oh, who are they? How old are they? And all that. And I'm just waiting for that. But it's something that we have to think about all day, every day, of these little tiny things that can just trigger a whole flood of emotions.
Yeah, and hopefully y'all will never have to deal with this, but dating after your spouse's death is really interesting, especially if, like, in a pandemic, you're using a website to do it. And so there are things that you have to check. And the thing that I have become very aware of lately is that most of the people that I'm meeting are divorced. Like, they're at a point in life where they're trying to find a new partner because whatever was happening in their previous relationship didn't work out. And whether they wanted to or not, they had some choice in dissolving that relationship. And I'm very much aware that that's not what, like, if it were up to me, I wouldn't be dating. I'd still be married to John. Um, I didn't choose to be apart from John, and I still have a million wonderful memories with John. And so, like, there was one person that I was dating at one point who said, "I want to hear about John because it lets me know more about you. And in hearing you talk about John, I know the love that you have to offer." But not everybody gets that. So, like, talking about the different things that you have to do, like checking that widow box, and then, like, it's interesting. Yeah, like, you can see them going, "Do I ask? Do I not ask?" Like, there was a guy that I dated for a good 2 months before he said, "So what did happen to your husband?" And I'm like, "I've been waiting for you to ask," you know?
Yeah, I think for me, I always just say I have 4 sons, and then if I have to get deeper into it, well, what are their age? Then I'll get in the story. It's always hard saying it because it feels incomplete when I say it, but for me, that's the story in that sense. And yes, I hope I never have to go through dating again.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Rachel, is there anything else that you want to share about John? I mean, we've covered so much tonight.
I'll just end by saying you have not had cheesecake if you didn't have one of John's cheesecakes. The man could cook.
And for those of you who know, I think that was a little dig from Rachel because I love cheesecake. So I think you're rubbing that in a little bit there, my friend.
I think you had one of his that year that we were working together. I think I brought one to the school at one point. So.
Yeah, yeah. So I think what I want to ask everybody who's listening is, first of all, thank you for listening. Chris and I are so thankful that you tune in every week. And I know Rachel, she's got a huge network, and I imagine that a lot of her friends and family are now going to be listening. We want to ask that you go back and listen to all the episodes because we think that they're really helpful. We've gotten some good notes from people already of, wow, thank you for that information. My best friend or whatever is dealing with this, and we taught them something that can help. But what I want to ask tonight is that everybody go back and listen to Rachel again very carefully. because I've been taking notes, and it's a long list of things that she has said that Chris and I have talked about that we want to talk about in the future or whatever. There was so much, if you really listen to Rachel's words carefully, so many little things that her family and friends, her network did that got her through this. So I truly hope that you'll all do that and just really dig in carefully and without distraction, because Rachel, wow, I learned from you, and we're in similar boats in a lot of ways, but we're in completely different boats. But you helped me tonight, so thank you.
Yeah, Rachel, I want to say thank you as well. It's been amazing getting to know you just in this time we've had together, this short amount of time. And like Dan said, I learned a lot. You seem like an amazing person and an amazing teacher. I'm sure your kids love working with you. And thank you so much for being our first guest. And now we have another permanent listener, Dan, so that's a good thing. We got to keep adding to that list. Make sure you share it, Rachel, so all your family's listening, all right?
I will, and thank you guys for letting me talk about John.
Well, thanks for joining us. So that's going to end this episode. I think we already know the answer, but Chris and I want to invite Rachel back again. And I could see this being more than just one more time, too. But there's more to Rachel's story. As she mentioned, that she lost her mom with right about a year after she lost John. And so we're going to invite Rachel back again so that she can share her story about her mother and see what else we can learn from that. And Rachel, we hope you'll join us, and we look forward to talking with you more. So thank you everybody for listening. Again, we value your feedback. If you have comments of things that you heard that really helped you, please let us know. If you have questions that have come up of how do you handle something or what do you say, please let us know, because we want to address all of that and make this as helpful as possible. You can email those to info@jamiesonsjoy.org. You can, if you're one of Rachel's friends and family, you can email them to her or send her a Facebook message, and I'm sure she'll pass them along. You can do a Facebook message to Chris and I. It doesn't matter how, just get us your feedback and your questions, and we would love to try to help them. And I guess until next time, Rachel and Chris, thanks for joining us, and we will see you all soon.